Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to our session today on addressing uncertainty in operationalizing precaution in impact assessment, decision-making, and beyond. My name is Jennifer Dorr, and it's my pleasure to be here today moderating the session. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands that we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and with the land and water around us. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people, and we recognize that there's a long history that has brought each of us to the land that we're on today. Please join me in taking a couple of moments of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we will each in our own way try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you for joining me in that moment of reflection. I hope that you will bring your own thoughts with you as we continue our discussion around the precautionary principle today. To that end, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our speakers. First, we have Justina Ray, who is President and Senior Scientist at the Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada and Adjunct Professor at the University of Toronto and Trent University. We have Scott Findlay, who wears many hats and was my professor back in university. Currently, he is an Associate Director at the University of Ottawa's Institute of Environment and an Associate Professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Ottawa. And he is also the Researcher in Residence at the Office of the Chief Science Advisor of Canada. Next, we have Heidi Klein, who is the Human and Community Wellbeing Lead with Two Worlds Consulting. And last but not least, we have one of my colleagues from the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, Steve Bonnell, who's a Manager of Strategic and Regional Assessments. The focus of this session will be on unpacking the precautionary principle, examining the practical implications of applying it, and identifying some of the challenges that we might run into when we put it into practice, especially in the context of impact assessment. Panelists will discuss several questions that we've prepared, but we'd also like to hear your answers to these questions that we'll be asking the panelists. So feel free to give us your thoughts in the chat box or ask panelists your own questions and we'll give them the chance to answer throughout the session. I will do my best to keep everyone on track in terms of time, and we'll make sure that we're responding with it in the given amount of time to keep everything on track. So I'm going to start by taking a moment to discuss how we define the precautionary principle, because there are many ways it can be defined. But as we were planning for this discussion, I think our panelists all come from very different backgrounds, but that they agreed the interesting part of this discussion was not to get too hung up on the definition. And so today we will be using, for the purposes of our discussion, the Supreme Court of Canada's definition as it's appearing on the screen now. So where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing measures to prevent environmental degradation. So with that as our basis, I will now invite all of our panelists to the screen, and I will turn to each of them to give us some of their opening thoughts, to introduce themselves and how they understand and have experienced the precautionary principle. First, we'll start with Justina, so I give the floor to you.
Thanks so much, and thank you everybody for coming to the session, and wish we could see each other in person. So I was very gratified to be invited to this panel. The precautionary principle is something that I've always been aware of, used in some instances, which I'll talk about in a moment. But as I dove into this more and discussed with my colleagues, it is much, we are guided, many of us are guided by our intuitive sense of the precautionary principle. And in that vein, we rarely visit the actual definitions or recognize that there are so many definitions. And I just thought, even though we don't want to wring our hands about this, we do have to at least acknowledge that many of us come from a more intuitive understanding of precautionary principle rather than the actual definitions, and that quite a few definitions exist. Some definitions even put in incorporate cost effectiveness, which is a dramatically different sort of situation than one that doesn't, for example. In this vein, the real true elements, though, that sort of have commonality in all definitions is that there needs to be a threat of serious and irreversible harm, and there's a lack of full scientific uncertainty. And the precautionary principle is a means to address that in that sense, and in both parts. But operationalizing that, of course, is why we're here and why it's been such a challenge. But we do know that there are many costs to excessive precaution. The cost of excessive precaution, if you have false positives, you can inhibit innovation, which is so desperately needed at these times. And there are more costs that perhaps might be unnecessary. But we also understand increasingly that there are costs to adopting wait and see modes and not adopting the precautionary principle. And we see that, the environment has eroded in significant ways. The wait and see model can lead to cumulative impacts. And we also understand that there are many times that we can't foresee the real threats until it's too late. So there's essential need to get to the sweet spot, to understand what the trade-offs are from going between one side and another. And really, where is the burden of scientific proof, in a sense? And that's what we're going to be exploring to some extent today. In terms of my own personal experience with this, I have not been in the case where I've had to make really significant decisions using the precautionary principle. More in the scientific realm, where science decisions are made using this principle or not, which feed into major decision making. But that's very, very different from places with an impact assessment for when you have to make decisions on projects, mitigation measures, and so forth. From a scientific perspective, for example, at COSEWIC and the Canadian Committee for the Conservation of Endangered Species and Wildlife, which is the committee that's mandated under the Species at Risk Act to make decisions about whether or not a species is assessed as threatened or endangered. The precautionary principle that's enshrined in that process is more about really focused on uncertainty and in determining whether or not a species is in one status or another. And that's a quite a different situation than if you're applying mitigation measures, or if you're making even more significant and consequential decisions related to whether a project goes through or not. And so I think that I'll leave it at that. And except to say one more thing is that a lot of the answers to questions that I'll be putting forward today relate to the fact that the precautionary principle in the context of impact assessment is really only one part. An impact assessment is a constellation of factors that have to play together. Things like transparency, decision making, and a whole host of factors that play into how the precautionary principle is going to be operationalized. And we'll come back to that theme later, but I just wanted to set the stage for that. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Justina. We'll now turn to Scott.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks everybody for attending this session. So I was asked to comment on two things. The first one was my experience with the precautionary principle, and that actually takes two forms, one in an academic setting. So in 2005, I and some colleagues, mostly legal scholars actually, were asked by the Law Commission of Canada to undertake an examination of how some emerging principles like the precautionary principle and the principle of adaptive management could be best accommodated in the current framework, or the current in 2005 framework of administrative law. And in this context, I looked at decisions by the Pest Management Regulatory Agency on new registrations and reevaluations of pesticides. And I was particularly interested in how, in making decisions on registration decisions, the PMRA dealt with the question of scientific uncertainty, because the precautionary principle is explicitly one of the principles that which the agency is supposed to make decisions. And then I guess the other major academic initiative that I was involved in is in 2013, a colleague of mine, Nathalie Chalifour, and I wrote a manual for the National Judicial Institute, which is an organization that looks into the continuing education of Canada's judiciary. And the manual was concerned with the interpretation of scientific evidence in the courtroom. And in particular, one of the sections of the manual dealt with some of the implications of the issue of something that Justina referred to, namely the burden of proof and standard of proof, the implications that flow from considerations like the precautionary principle. And then in the non-academic setting, in 1993, and this is going a long way back now, I was part of a working group that presented to the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development in the early precursor of what we now know as SARA. This was in 1993 or 1994, on how best to incorporate the precautionary principle into what was then a draft bill. And also in 2008 to 2010, I was part of the Challenge Advisory Panel, which was a panel constituted under the Chemicals Management Plan. And we were charged with assisting Health Canada and Environment Canada in ensuring that decisions about chemicals under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act were appropriately precautionary and used an appropriate weight of evidence approach to decision making. So that's kind of my academic and non-academic experience. And that experience, I guess, has led me to what I would consider to be two considerations about the precautionary principle now, both of which, and if we look at the definition, the Bergen definition that Jen alluded to, this is now 3 decades old. I would say that that definition, and even more so the Rio definition, has some pretty substantial shortcomings in 2020. In fact, I would call them grievous shortcomings. The first one is operational, namely that it's really unclear in the definition how the concept of scientific uncertainty is supposed to be regarded, and in particular, whether it's supposed to be a trigger for application of the precautionary principle, or whether it is a factor to be considered in determining how precautious a decision should be. And I should say that in my view, some of the Supreme Court decisions that have made allusions to the, or reference the precautionary principle, like Hudson versus Spray Tech and Castlegate Blasting versus Ontario, have actually, in my view, almost served to muddy the waters on this issue. And then the final point, the second limitation that I would point to is that the precautionary principle, as stated in Bergen or Rio, is really about negative rights. It talks about what decision makers ought not to do. In other words, not to use scientific uncertainty as a reason for postponing action to prevent environmental degradation. And I would argue that principles that are based explicitly on the notion of negative rights are outdated. What we need now are principles that focus on positive rights, namely not what decision makers should not do, but rather what they should do. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. Our next speaker will be Heidi.
Hi, thanks, Jennifer. Hello, everyone. I'm here as an environmental assessment practitioner, and as Jennifer introduced, I work for a consulting company. And so I've had, I'm going to say, a slightly different introduction to the precautionary principle, but I will say that my introduction to the precautionary principle did begin when I was working at Environment Canada, and had to look at the Rio Declaration and had to look at the Canadian Environment Protection Act, and eventually how it was emerging in the decision-making process in the in impact assessments, especially as a principal test for significance determinations. And at the time, as someone with a very Western science perspective, I actually valued having the precautionary principle because it provided at least some direction on how to consider significance determinations in the face of uncertainty. But with time, my perspective has changed, and this was primarily when I was living in the Northwest Territories. It was there that I was seeing firsthand the emerging use of the precautionary principle, like very active use of the precautionary principle in impact assessment practices, especially where there were cultural differences or different cultural perspectives when it came to looking at an impact or a risk or a harm to the environment. The precautionary principle very much, along with sustainability principles, became part of core decision making. And bringing together different knowledge systems and different values. Initially, in the early 90s, it was still very much a Western science bias in terms of the knowledge systems, but as there was the growing inclusion of Indigenous knowledge and impact assessments, it was changing the reflection of how decisions were made and what precaution and the precautionary principle needed to look like. So, in preparing for this conference, I actually had to take another look at the precautionary principle and what's been happening over the past few decades. And I've somewhat come to the conclusion that even though it's not an explicit requirement in many jurisdictions, I think it may have actually been a silent driver, along with sustainability principles, behind impact assessment practices. With the precautionary principle, the scrutiny around projects and impact assessments in particular grew. Projects could be rejected if it was felt that the measures to prevent environmental degradation weren't adequate. The approvals bar was moving. And I think the precautionary principle may have indirectly been leading towards, or has led towards, better data, better information, improved mitigation and proof of mitigation, the introduction of adaptive management strategies, especially when uncertainty is encountered, and more extensive post-project monitoring, and which includes the affected communities. And so my perspective on the precautionary principle has really moved from one of a sort of a Western science to one that's inclusive of a number of different knowledge bases, but fundamentally they all sort of end up in, depending upon the practice, in a similar place where everyone wants to ensure that the appropriate precautions have been taken when making a decision around impact assessment. Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi. And before we turn to our last speaker to lead off our introductions, I just want to tell people that if they have questions, they are free to submit them in the Q&A as we will be answering audience questions, so don't feel shy. And with that, Steve, I will turn the floor to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this discussion as well. I think it's very interesting and really timely. I just want to quickly start with a bit of background, a bit of context in terms of where I sort of come at this from my experience. So I'm an impact assessment practitioner. I have about 20 years experience, primarily as a consultant or as part of a proponent team. So I'm fairly new to government and very new to the role that I'm currently in. So mostly I've been involved again as an impact assessment practitioner, working on IAs for major projects in a variety of sectors. So mostly what I'm interested in is how do you deal with uncertainty and how do you incorporate precaution in the planning and conduct of an impact assessment itself, as opposed to necessarily just in the eventual decision that comes at the end. A lot of my work in recent years has been around projects and IAs in the marine environment in particular, which folks will know sort of within that setting, there's inherently some very interesting and very challenging aspects of knowledge and data and so forth that creates some questions around how do you deal with uncertainty and precaution. Usually you're dealing with large study areas. Data availability and quality are variable at best and usually incomplete. Usually in marine environments for marine projects and IAs, we've got less than a complete understanding of disturbances and effects. You know, what are the behavioral effects associated with underwater noise and what are the ecological consequences of those things? So we're inevitably dealing with situations of uncertainty that as practitioners, we need to find a way to deal with. I guess, I mean, my approach, I've found that either we can be paralyzed by uncertainty or we can find good, solid analytical ways to try to deal with it. And usually from a planning and conduct of impact assessment perspective, what it comes down to is often making some conservative and precautionary assumptions in how we assess and evaluate potential effects in any impact assessment. For example, just back to the marine project and effects context that I mentioned before, very often, you know, we don't have enough information to know will a particular species happen to be in that particular area within the zone of influence of a project at a particular time. Oftentimes then from an impact assessment perspective, it makes sense to be precautionary and conservative in assuming that it will, to assume that the environmental component is present and available to be affected, and we base the effects predictions and the mitigative proposals from an IA on that assumption. In the same way for some of the analysis, some of the modeling that we do in an impact assessment, you know, looking at things like oil spills, we assume a non-mitigated spill, even though everybody knows the spill will be mitigated. It'll be prevented, hopefully, but certainly will be immediately responded to. But we take the precautionary conservative approach in doing the work and assessing the effects. So again, oftentimes it's a matter of incorporating precaution into the nature and some of the assumptions that we make. One of the other interesting things that I want to raise, just from an IA perspective, is I think it's really interesting to consider how some of our standards, some of our traditional IA methodologies have kind of, I think, in some ways created rather than help solve challenges with respect to uncertainty. Impact assessment is a predictive exercise. Of course it is. It'll always be that. But in predicting and evaluating effects in an impact assessment, I've always been a pretty strong proponent of being as specific and as quantitative as we can and need to be, but also for certain situations, for certain issues, allowing ourselves to be more general and qualitative where you must and where it makes sense to do so. And I think impact assessment practitioners and regulators and other participants always seem to get a bit preoccupied with trying to predict and evaluate effects using some of these, I'll call them tired old IA methodologies that we all love to hate, you know, the matrices and the effects ratings and trying to determine the magnitude and put a number on each individual effect. It's the old precision versus accuracy issue. And I think sometimes we need to step back and think, do these sorts of methods is that really the best way to try to understand and describe and address the potential effects in an EA? So I think there's increasing calls in the IA community, and I share this in some situations, that it's okay to be general and issues based as opposed to trying to sort of quantify and predict in a quantified way. So I mean, the objective really needs to be that we try to ensure that we have a good understanding of the issue, of the management objective, and ensure that we throw all the required and reasonable mitigation at that particular issue to satisfy ourselves and the public and the decision maker that the issue can and will be addressed. So I'm a little bit concerned that in some cases our IA methods have evolved into creating the illusion or the fear of predictive uncertainty, when in a lot of cases we'll be a lot better served by a more general issues-based approach and a good healthy dose of precaution in how we try to understand and manage effects. So a bit of a practitioner's rant, I suppose, about how we deal with the inevitable uncertainty that we deal with in impact assessment every day because of the predictive nature of the exercise. Thanks.
Thanks to all of our speakers. I think that's a great introduction to get a sense of everyone's different backgrounds and how you're approaching the precautionary principle. I'm going to turn now to our first discussion question. And that question is, what values and worldviews issues are implicit to any implementation of the precautionary principle? And I think, Heidi, you talked about how you came from a place that the precautionary principle had a very Western science bias, and you've seen some evolution to think about cultural values. So I'm going to invite you to be the first person to answer this question, to maybe talk a bit more about the values and worldviews issues in implementation.
Thank you, Jennifer. This was an interesting question to think about, and I'm going to say similar to Steve, and I actually had to go back and think about the whole process of the impact assessment. I'm going to say the process of impact assessment. And my starting point was actually, I think values and value issues are integral and implicit in the impact assessment process. In fact, we start things off by actually asking people, what are your value components? So we already introduced the idea that what we want to look at is what we think is most important to you as someone who may be affected by a project. And these valued components are going to come from a variety of sources, whether or not it is scientists inside the federal, provincial, territorial governments or universities, whether or not it's Indigenous groups, local community members, and any other stakeholders. Everyone brings a different value system and a different epistemology to the table, and how they see the world and what's important and what they're willing to see as uncertain or what they're willing to see as a risk. And so this completely influences even how the research gets started, because there may be some things we don't consider looking at because it wasn't actually raised as part of the impact assessment process and as a valued component. And that then leads us through to even how conclusions are reached about the residual effects, and going back to how do you evaluate those residual effects? What are the parameters we use? The extent of the mitigation that's required for a particular issue. So I would actually say that values are at the crux of most impact assessments, and implicit in then in the application of the precautionary principle. In my personal experience in the impact assessment process, as already said in my introduction, it started off very much with a Western science bias that was brought to the table, and this was when I was an executive director of an impact assessment board. And on one side, and then Indigenous groups bringing a cultural science perspective to the table and asking the board to decide, well, who's whose concept is better in terms of what is happening in the environment or what could happen in the environment. And this is not, no board wants to be in this situation. It's not a very satisfactory way of proceeding. And so what I've seen in terms of the application of the precautionary principle, and even in the approach to researching projects and bringing in other value systems, is we're bringing together nature, culture, and society, where at one time there would have been more of a disconnection between nature, culture, and society. And so the process of impact assessment and the application of the precautionary principle has really, I'm going to say, started to embrace or be alternatively interpreted by practitioners, so that various perspectives and benchmarks or concerns are factored into the decision making. And I would say overall, in some ways, I've seen that we've, I'm going to say in some ways, improved the robustness of the impact assessment process, and maybe have not had to turn to the precautionary principle as much as we've had to in the past in the face of uncertainty, because the practices of bringing different knowledge systems together and different values together has adapted the impact assessment process.
Thanks, Heidi. And Scott, I will also give you a few moments to answer the same question.
Okay, thanks very much, Jen. So as Heidi articulated already, values enter in explicitly at the very start of the process through the characterization of valued components. And I don't want to talk about that. I'd like to talk about some value-related issues that come in and are hugely important at an operational level. So not in terms of defining valued or characterizing valued components, but stuff that's really important at an operational level in decision-making and determining the appropriate decisions to take. And the first one is right there in the definition when we characterize, and the definition applies to harms, environmental harms or environmental health harms that are severe and irreversible. And this leads directly to the question of what is a threshold for severity. And of course, this varies from person to person. So what I might consider to be a severe effect, other people may not consider to be a severe effect with respect to the particular threshold that defines severity. And I don't think you need to have, there's a classic, and I think will become a textbook example of this now with the COVID-19 situation. You have, we have evidence and fairly good evidence on, for example, the number of excess deaths that's related to COVID-19. But if you go to different people or different segments of society, their perception of how severe that is varies dramatically. And so here's a non-factual issue, a value implicit issue that enters directly into the start of the process, which is whether or not, in fact, the precautionary principle has been triggered. A second one, which Justina has already made reference to her introductory remarks, is the standard of proof. So again, going back to the operational issue, we need to define how much evidence is required in order for us to conclude that there's a credible proof or credible threat of severe effect or an irreversible effect. And so again, this is a normative issue. There's no science that can tell us what that threshold standard of proof should be. And yet it's critically important in the operationalization of precaution in the decision-making context. A third one is an issue with which we're all familiar with, and that is the extent to which the threshold for severity or the standard of proof is influenced by other values. Anybody who has a financial advisor knows that what he or she will do for right out of the gate is ask you what your risk tolerance is. And if you have a relationship with that financial advisor, they'll ask you that several times a year. Why? Because they know that your risk tolerance varies with the circumstances. And yet, in the legal instantiation of the precautionary principle, in every legal context that I've seen it, whether it's in law or policy, or regulation rather, there's no real opportunity for characterizing thresholds and standards of proof or modifying them in relation to the circumstances. We have a uniform criteria for application having to do with severity and harm, and there's little opportunity and certainly no prescription for the contextual dependence of either the threshold for severity or the standard of proof required to demonstrate same. And finally, and I realize that this is a bit heretical, and it reflects a little bit of background that I didn't give in my introduction. I was at one stage in my life a game theorist, and game theorists are very interested in what constitutes a winning strategy in a game. And in some games, the so-called maximin strategy is a winning strategy. So that's a strategy where you try to minimize the worst possible scenario. And in a sense, the precautionary principle is exactly that type of a strategy. It tries to minimize the worst possible damages, explicitly in the Bergen definition, environmental damages. But as a game theorist, I can tell you that there's all sorts of games where that strategy is actually not a winning strategy. In fact, it's a losing strategy. And so it's an interesting question operationally, and this goes back to the context dependence. Well, thus far we've concentrated on the precautionary principle as kind of the equivalent of a maximin strategy in a game, and yet we know that there are all sorts of games where it's not a winning strategy. So is this something that we should be thinking about, going back to my comment that I made in my introduction, is we try and haul the precautionary principle into the 21st century and think about this notion of positive rights and moving away from a maximin strategy, or at least thinking about the potential that the application of that type of a principle should be context dependent. So those are, I think, four different, they're not actually values, but they're normative principles that are hugely important at an operational level in making decisions under a precautionary principle or a precautionary approach. And yet we haven't spent a lot of time thinking about the implication of those principles, of those normative principles. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. I have not seen any questions from the audience yet. A reminder that we are very happy to answer your questions. And so if you'd like to send a particularly challenging question to the panelists, I'm sure that they would be very happy to answer. And if not, we'll move to the next question that I'd like to ask, which is, what is meant and implied by exercising precaution where there are contributions from multiple knowledge systems, and what methods might be best suited? And so first up in answering this question, we'll have Steve. And Steve, I took note in your opening remarks that you referred to some of our tired old methodologies in impact assessment. So I'm interested to hear about what are some of the methods for implementation that work a bit better, more in depth. So go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And I guess particularly from a knowledge systems perspective, again, I'll sort of come at this from an impact assessment practitioner's perspective, again, in terms of planning and conduct of an IA. And I think there's a really interesting dimension to these issues. In impact assessment in Canada in particular, and folks will know, I guess the most important, the most salient example of this ideas, the need to consider both Western science and Indigenous knowledge in an impact assessment. From my experiences, I guess, first of all, it's really interesting to see how our definition and how the conceptualization of IK and its role in impact assessment has really evolved and expanded considerably in recent years in particular. And I guess we've moved in the impact assessment community, we've moved a long ways from the early view of IK as tech, it being traditional ecological knowledge, it being about what Indigenous groups know about the existing environment, biophysical environment, as a result of their traditional use over many generations, or information about a community's land use patterns. And we've sort of gotten to finally gotten to a much broader view and perspective about what Indigenous knowledge is, where it's viewed and incorporated as an overall Indigenous worldview perspective about potential effects and their importance and their implications for the environment and for Indigenous communities and their ways of life. So I think that's a really neat, from a knowledge system perspective, IK sort of becoming that, as opposed to sort of a source of data or as a source of information or whatever. It becomes more of an evaluative context that comes into an impact assessment that gives us a better sense and a better view of looking at effects through a different lens and from a different perspective. So I think that's really neat, and it fits really well with the issues and objectives approach to impact assessment that I outlined in my earlier remarks. Not necessarily always about trying to quantify effects, but rather to view the effects and evaluate the effects, in this case, in the context of Indigenous interests and perspective. So I think that's really useful, very valuable, and an increasingly important view of impact assessment. So using that knowledge system, bringing it into an EA, an IA, learning more about how Indigenous communities view effects and their importance or implications. What is the required and desired state or health of the environment, and how do the effects of a project relate to these things? In my experience, and again in my specific experience as an impact assessment practitioner, and in recent assessments that have had the benefit of obtaining and being able to incorporate that Indigenous worldview into the assessment, it's really interesting because that approach seems to inherently take a precautionary outlook, where again, projects and assessments I've been involved in had Indigenous communities say this is not about requiring proof of an effect or a lack thereof. It's not about assigning responsibility for that particular effect or the technical feasibility of a particular piece of mitigation. It's about demonstrating overall an appropriate type and degree of planning and precaution that's in keeping with the needs and the objectives and the views and perspectives of an Indigenous community. So really, really interesting perspective and really valuable knowledge system and impact assessment that, again, just to sort of conclude, the main takeaway for me has always been that the realization that in many cases Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous worldviews, precaution is a key part of that worldview, and this is a really interesting mechanism to inherently bring precaution into the discussion and impact assessment through the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. And I think, Heidi, I'll give you the chance to answer, and I'm sure you'll have an interesting perspective to add on how the science and the Indigenous knowledge systems work together.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. Oh, there's an echo. Is everything okay? All right. I don't know what to add to Stephen because that was sort of my starting notes. So I'm going to instead focus on some of the practices that I've seen that allow for the better weaving together of Western science and Indigenous knowledge. And I completely agree with Stephen in terms of the Indigenous groups with whom I've worked with in the past. There's a degree of pragmatism and inherent precaution that is built into the cultures of many Indigenous communities. And so rather than belabor what Stephen has said already, I'm going to look at some of the current methods that I think are I'm going to say leading the way in some ways in terms of bringing the pieces together. And so the first one I'm going to talk about is the holistic approach. We've often heard in the impact assessment process, especially where Indigenous communities are involved, that it's too single species focused, and that's not how the world is seen. And so what I'm seeing more and more in impact assessment reports and in the preparation of impact assessments is a more holistic approach and trying different methods and techniques that allow for systems to be diagrammed or pathways to be diagrammed that then lets all parties in the impact assessment process bring together their perception of how the natural environment, the social environment, the cultural environment, and even the economic environments can work together. And so it's moving away from a single species perspective, which is where we really started in the impact assessment process, and that's those matrices that Stephen was talking about and what's important, and looking at sort of like a real world concept of how does the world actually work, and can we then use this pathways work or this holistic work to have a discussion around what do we want in the future, what's the objective. Where do people see themselves? And so we're moving away from, I would say, almost an impact assessment to more of a planning for our futures. What do we want to see in our future? What are we willing to have changed? And what are we willing to, for cultural reasons, want to make sure is not changed? And so these pathways diagrams, sometimes with plus and minus arrows, to reflect what can be changed and what cannot be changed, is I'm finding as a very encouraging way of bringing groups together. But that does also mean a project proponent has to spend the time in the communities, bring the collective values together, and do these pathways maps, and then use them really as a guidepost or as a guide on how to approach the impact assessment, how to approach the project design, working with engineers, changing the project designs as may be required. The other practice that I've seen that has, I'm going to say, really paid off in the impact assessment process is where you actually have the knowledge holders and the scientists working together in the data collection, in the monitoring, sharing the knowledge out in the field, and their perspective of what the environment looks like and how it operates. And that allows for a discussion in terms of where are the knowledge systems similar in their perspective and how the environment works, where is it complementary, and where are they divergent. And I would say that in those cases where a divergent view of the environment is identified, that might be where we need to be focusing our studies. It's like, well, why do we have different perspectives on the environment? And let's have a look at that. And that in and of itself is taking a look at those divergent divergent perspectives together is a form of precaution. And so I also see that as a very positive move forward. But again, it requires environmental assessment practitioners and project proponents to really work closely together and understand that these kinds of collaboration actually have a value in the impact assessment process. Another thing that what I've seen and would highly recommend is actually co-management and community-based monitoring, especially where adaptive management has been proposed as an approach in the impact assessment process where there is uncertainty, is approach it, design it, plan it in the form of a co-management structure and a community-based monitoring structure, because it provides supportive learning on all fronts, and an easier way of research, completing the research and sharing the findings, and so that there's a broader understanding of what is happening in the environment. It adds to the transparency, which Justina has mentioned, and it actually reduces the uncertainty, especially in communities where people wonder, it's like, okay, well, what's happening? We don't know what's happening. They get a once-year report, and somehow that's unsatisfactory. So when considering adaptive management procedures, think about building in co-management and community-based monitoring, and so that the way forward is being planned together. And so anyway, those are sort of the three primary methods and approaches that I've seen in the practice of bringing Western science and Indigenous knowledge together. And I think they're well suited to addressing concerns related to harm or uncertainty and aspects of the precautionary principle, because they essentially are collaborative processes, and so you're not creating sort of tiers or separate streams of understanding, but you're trying to bring the collective understandings together. Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi. And I'm starting to see that we're getting some questions from the audience, which is so great to see. I'm just reading through those now, so we'll be sure to answer those in a moment. For the moment, I am just going to move on to our next question, which will be answered first by Scott and then by Justina. And Scott, I believe this is the question you were the most looking forward to discussing today. And it is, what are the operational criteria for determining whether a candidate decision is appropriately precautious? And I'm just pulling up your slide for you. If our tech could pull up Scott and the slide together, please.
Thanks, Jen. While I see the slide, I also am getting a bit of an echo. Right, so this was in fact, full disclosure, my question, and I have a very selfish reason for posing it. In my capacity as researcher in residence at the Office of the Chief Science Advisor, I am leading a review of the methods and integrity of the science used in impact assessment under the new Impact Assessment Act. And as part of that process, we are trying to develop some tools that federal officials, third parties, proponents, and stakeholders or shareholders could potentially use in assessing the integrity, credibility, and transparency of impact assessment science. And one of the issues that's come up repeatedly is something that would enable, a tool that would enable decision makers at various stages in the process, not at the final project decision stage, but all along in the process, as already been alluded to, decide whether a decision is appropriately precautious. So as I think Justina already referred to, you can imagine decisions which are too precautious, and there's been a lot of work done on the potential for overly precautious decisions to stifle innovation and basically congeal the technology development process. And you can also imagine decisions that are not sufficiently precautious. And so I've attempted, probably poorly, to illustrate that those two scenarios in this slide. So in this slide, each of those dots represents a candidate decision, and on the bottom axis you have an axis that defines how precautionary a decision needs to be, and on the y-axis how precautionary a candidate decision is. And essentially what we would be looking for is a tool that would help people to determine whether the decision that they're taking lies essentially on that 45-degree line or close enough. And so to distinguish decisions that are appropriately precautionary as I say, all the way along the impact assessment process, from those that are inappropriately precautionary, i.e. either too precautious or insufficiently precautious. And so I've been working to develop some criteria for the determination of how precautious a decision should be. And of course, this is something that a lot of people have worked on in the past. And so my reason for putting in this question was just to solicit some feedback from the audience about what criteria I can use. I'm being unabashedly selfish and in fact parasitic here, but some of these criteria are probably pretty well known to people. So for example, the idea that a decision, the precaution that's exercised should be proportional to the risk, the estimated risk of serious or irreversible harm. It should reflect the true uncertainty, by which I mean not just statistical imprecision, associated with the effectiveness of mitigation measures. So the more uncertainty about the effectiveness of efforts to mitigate adverse effects, the more precautious we should be. And probably the audience is familiar with these sorts of criteria, but I've been actually more interested in exploring some other criteria, again, in keeping with my my idea that we actually need to move the precautionary principle forward into the 21st century. So here are a couple that might be a bit controversial or maybe even heretical. One is the distribution of adverse effects versus benefits. So, principles of natural justice suggest that benefits and costs should be equally distributed, and yet this is not something that's actually explicitly or implicitly taken into account often in decision making. And so it's interesting to contemplate one criteria being the extent to which there's a discrepancy between the distribution of adverse effects, be they environmental or health, and the distribution of benefits. This is particularly important in the context of the new Impact Assessment Act, where the Section 63 determinative public interest factors, the first one is contribution to sustainability, which includes both positive and negative effects. Relating to the notion of values and valued components, it seems to me that the diversity of components that are negatively affected, i.e. have adverse effects on them, is important. So all else being equal, we should be more precautious if there's a bunch of valued components that are expected to have serious or irreversible effects versus not. The magnitude of potential estimated positive effects is another one. Hitherto, people will know that under the old Act, it was all about adverse effects. The current Act takes into account both positive and negative effects. So these issues relating to uncertainty and seriousness or magnitude have to be applied not only to the negative, i.e. adverse effects, but also to the positive effects. So those are some examples of criteria that I and our team and my team are contemplating incorporating into this tool that would allow federal officials and proponents and stakeholders / shareholders get a handle on whether decisions are appropriately precautionary right through the IA process, right from characterization of valued components right through to compliance monitoring and follow-up. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Scott. We'll now turn to Justina, and I will let you be the first person to answer Scott's question.
Well, actually, I'm not going to be able to add very much more than what Scott put forward, because my one example that was going to be sort of similar to his was about cost benefit, evaluating the cost benefits. But he's explained that very well, and I think I'd like to sort of challenge the notion of operational criteria a wee bit by sort of providing an alternative way to look at operationalizing the precautionary principle. I mean, first of all, it's going back to some earlier comments about values, like to determine what is appropriately or sufficiently precautious will always be in the eye of the beholder. And it is in and of itself a value judgment that's rooted in, you know, people's individual tolerance to risk. And people will themselves determine trade-offs to see where they are in that sweet spot. And also it'll depend on what vantage point they are, how much they trust the information that's determining risk, and so on. And so I think what is more important, perhaps, either as an alternative to or as a supplement to operational criteria, is to build a robust sort of decision-making framework for applying the precautionary principle. And this not only has to have with it very clear guidance and understanding of the elements of the actual definition, you know, to put it in front of people so that they're not just applying the precautionary principle in the way that they sort of inherently understand it or intuitively, that it's actually consistently applied in the same, with attention to the same elements. I think that's one critical piece, but then also laying out when and how decision makers must apply the principle. And that's just a sort of a framework, but the really important piece, I think, is ensuring that the communication and the transparency of the decisions are very, very clear, so that when the precautionary principle is applied in a decision, that the decision maker makes very clear how he or she interpreted, or they interpreted, the precautionary principle in this context, how it was used in the decision, to disclosing the reasons, and also, you know, being very clear as much as possible about the nature of the uncertainty in front of them and the risks that are going to be taken one way or the other with this decision. And I think a lot of that is inherent in the Act itself. There's a lot of those elements in there. There certainly were a lot of promises before the Act came forward that was the intention, to increase transparency of decision making, and so on. So I think that if that is truly improved upon and much more disclosed and communicated, then we may not have to rely so much on operational criteria. We may be able to tolerate more individual, values and perceptions of risk, because we'll be able to see how people took those kinds of things into account in rendering their decisions. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Justina. So as I mentioned, we have our first few questions from the audience. So I'm going to give both Heidi and Stephen a couple of minutes each to answer our first question. And Heidi, I believe you started to speak to this already in your remarks. The question is, wondering if panelists have thoughts on the application of the precautionary principle in decision-making when evidence and information from different knowledge systems diverge. So Heidi, I'll give you about 2 minutes to answer that.
Okay, I'll be brief. I'm going to say that with the decision makers I've worked with in the past, when they've encountered a situation where the knowledge systems diverge on their perspective in relation to the impacts, I'm going to honestly say they hate that. But they treat both parties the same. Similar to what Justina was just saying, is they look for the evidence on both sides. And so I've seen in some cases decision makers weigh in terms of Western science, and in other cases in terms of Indigenous knowledge if they had to. But often what I've seen is the first step they say is they send the parties out of the room and say, resolve it and come back to us with a solution. I've absolutely seen that because they, it's almost like the last thing you want to be in impact assessment is to be the decision maker. You want to be presented with a project or a situation that is acceptable to the parties, but that doesn't always happen. And when that doesn't happen, I've absolutely seen the decision makers, in this case the northern boards, really question both the Western science that's been presented and the Indigenous knowledge that's been presented and test it the same way. And when they write up their decisions, they do so with the transparency that Justina was just talking about on why they accepted one perspective or one knowledge type over another. But as I said, more often than not, the first thing I see when these kinds of situations have been encountered is the decision makers, through their staff will often say, go back and try and solve it, because we'd rather not be the one who almost arbitrates or say this is the situation, because that's not acceptable to anyone. Thank you.
Thanks. That was within your 2 minutes. Great job. Steve, did you have anything you would like to add to that?
Just a couple of really quick things, and most of my perspectives and certainly my experience would echo the points that Heidi made. Absolutely. I mean, interestingly, like in my experience in impact assessment, I haven't seen a whole lot of examples of conflicts between different knowledge systems, for Western science versus Indigenous knowledge. They come to different conclusions about effects or whatever. It's more about, again, if we kind of take that Indigenous worldview perspective and a context to look at effects, I find mostly the two knowledge systems are complementary, and the main reason that they're complementary is the Indigenous knowledge perspective is often acts as a bit of a tempering mechanism to the rest, to sort of bring in that additional level or dimension of precaution and so forth. So in that way, you could consider that they work quite well together in my experience so far, anyway.
Great, thanks. I'm going to move on to our next discussion question, and then we'll come back to the audience questions. So our next question is about environmental thresholds and how they should be taken into account under the precautionary principle. And so for that one, I will turn back to Justina.
Okay, well, thank you. I've been preoccupied a lot with the notion of environmental thresholds. It's so bloody attractive in the sense of thinking of tipping points and thinking of, because the whole legal system is sort of designed in this fashion that you're either on one side or the other in terms of being right or wrong, in a sense, and so being able to match, in the spirit of evidentiary decision making, to be able to match, that kind of threshold concept, which works so well in a regulatory environment with science and ecology and so on, is very attractive. But and Chris Johnson from University of University of Northern British Columbia and I wrote a chapter recently for a handbook of cumulative impact assessment that's about to come out by Jill Blakely and Daniel Franks. And we looked specifically at the challenge and opportunity of applying ecological thresholds to environmental assessment decision making. And through that process really determined that it just happens extremely rarely, of course, that you can have any kind of an identified threshold in a true ecological system, given everything that's going on, and I'm not going to go into those details. But that fast forward, sort of our major conclusion is really that you've got to be thinking about this more as a continuum of risk. and that in some cases we do have a good sense about when we're kind of, getting into a higher risk situation. But to answer the question, how much is too much, just degradation and so forth, when is the tipping point going to be, is almost impossible most of the time. And in fact, you could argue that if it were possible, then we wouldn't really need the precautionary principle too often, because then it would be clear, and then we'd have this threshold, and we could just apply that, and it would be a wonderful and objective and non-controversial means of making decisions. But that just doesn't happen. So again, we're back to where we are anyway, which is really like thinking about the precautionary principle itself is not applied to the risk assessment. It's applied to when you have information about the risk. And then you're going to make a decision in the context of that risk. And so I think, that's where we are in reality. And ecological thresholds, environmental thresholds in general are not likely to help us most of the time.
Thanks, Justina. And next to answer that question will be Heidi.
All right, thank you. Well, again, it's nice when someone else goes in front of me because it makes my discussion easier. I don't actually have much to add in terms of what Justina said. I may have a slightly different perspective on it, but I will also say that this was probably the most challenging question that was put in front of me, and it really got me again thinking about the extent to which the precautionary principle, as I said at the beginning, was almost like a silent driver in terms of many of the practices that we use in impact assessment, including the necessity for a defined threshold, which if you go to the old manuals and books of 20, 30 years ago, they show that defined threshold and how far you're deviating from the threshold and things like that. And I'm going to say much of what I've seen in the practice of environmental assessment these days is we don't see a defined threshold, and it shouldn't be surprising because thresholds are value laden. As Justina already introduced, they're related to risks, the uncertainty, what we're willing to accept, and based on that sort of thinking and reflection in preparation for this question, I started looking at two practices in particular where I can't help but think that perhaps we need to step back a bit and actually think about the need to define a threshold, even if it is a dynamic threshold, because of cumulative impacts, and really needing to understand what we are doing to the natural environment, especially in relation to cumulative impacts, and especially capturing those changes that are not normally captured as part of the impact assessment process, where with cumulative impacts you say, well, what other projects in the area have the same kind of effect? And so I was looking at the practice of regional assessments and the opportunity to use regional assessments to better define trends, changes, environmental factors that define the current baseline, and using that as a chance to possibly actually reintroduce the idea of bringing in a threshold, because even with regional assessments, a number of them are done without actually defining what that future state is and what you're willing to accept. So they've become sort of the regional assessment and changes sort of is in lieu of the putting a threshold in place that says this is where we're at, and then the discussion will move to where do we want to be in the future. But we don't capture, have we gone past where we want to be? And so I like the idea of regional assessments, but I think they could probably benefit from being strengthened by actually going back to asking questions in relation to, do we need to establish thresholds in some cases? The other practice that I was looking at was that of monitoring and adaptive management, because more and more both of these are presented in lieu of actually providing a mitigation. And it's put out there that, well, we don't know what's going to happen, so we're going to track this and make adjustments as we go. But again, without knowing what you're targeting or what a threshold might be, how do you know when to make an adjustment? What is the trigger, as a couple of the speakers already talked about? What is the trigger? When do we need to actually respond or make a change? And so when it came to thinking about the precautionary principle and thresholds, I think in many cases our approach in terms of what's Stephen has already introduced of issues and objectives is a good one, but there may actually be times when it's not adequate. And things around cumulative effects was definitely where I saw the chance to actually reintroduce the idea of bringing in defined thresholds, especially because we have science policies in those areas of cumulative effects such as climate change or species at risk or habitat, the need for habitat protection. And so, yeah, I'm essentially saying that at this point, the steps forward in terms of where we've dealt with the absence of thresholds and taking a precautionary approach makes sense, but we may need to step back and say, well, does it always make sense to do this? And I would say the place where we really need to think about reintroducing thresholds or making thresholds part of the design is where we've got real concerns about cumulative effects.
Thanks, Heidi. So I am going to turn now to a timely question from the audience, and I believe, Scott, you're going to be the one to answer this. So this question is from Vanessa, and she asks, drawing on the idea that decision makers should be guided by positive rights principles, what they ought to do, how can the precautionary principle be applied relative to addressing areas of uncertainty in public health, such as pandemic preparedness?
Okay, well, great question, and one that I'm struggling to answer, but let me give it a shot. First of all, it should come as no surprise that I think a precautionary principle for the 21st century should emphasize positive rights, not negative rights. So in the context of a new or novel, I'm not sure what an emerging technology is, but let's consider a new or novel technology. By definition, there will be comparatively few data and information on either A, the adverse effects thereof, or B, the positive effects thereof. And so how I would proceed would be to say, okay, let's look at a set of valued components and assess those with respect not to the estimated effects, but rather, first and foremost, with respect to the estimated uncertainties about the effects. I would then focus the decision making, and this is now the positive rights dimension of it. I would focus the decision making on the valued components where there's the highest degree of uncertainty about the adverse effects, bearing in mind the countervailing assessment of positive effects. And at a practical level, what I would use that to do is to inform two things. First of all, the science on effects, either positive or negative, that should be done in kind of a pre-technology deployment phase. And secondly, to use that to prioritize the way by which the technology is deployed and the follow-up monitoring regime. So if you've identified something, a set of valued components for which you have a high degree of uncertainty about the negative, the adverse effects, then what you would do is ensure that the way that the technology is deployed is designed such that if those negative effects start to be realized in the follow-up monitoring, you can get the technology back in the box, as it were. And by the way, this situation has arisen exactly in the COVID-19 case because, of course, the public is concerned about deployment of new technologies, vaccines in particular, but we know that the potential benefits of an effective vaccine on a whole bunch of valued components may be very, very large. So here's another textbook example of how we need to consider not only the adverse effects of decisions, in this case about a new and novel technology, but also the positive effects of those decisions.
Thanks, Scott. That is a great segue to our last discussion question. So I'm going to throw our last two panelists a bit of a curveball. So one of the things we're going to be talking about is what is the appropriate interaction between the precautionary principle and adaptive management. And I'd also like to link that to one of the questions from our audience, which I think ties well to what Scott was saying. As one of our audience members has pointed out that the absence of evidence demonstrating risk is not the same thing as absence of risks. So I'm wondering if you could speak to different approaches to applying the precautionary principle in the absence of evidence. And so I think that links well to this question on adaptive management. And so I will pass the floor to Steve. And as we're approaching the end of our session, you have about 4 minutes to make your remarks.
Yeah, I'll do that. Thanks. Thanks for. Oh, I've got a bit of an echo. I don't know if you can hear me. Okay. I'll probably stick to my script and I'll give Justina a chance to think about the question a bit more as I kind of wade through some of the background. But yeah, just in general, I mean, I think it's really interesting in terms of the role or the interaction of sort of an adaptive management approach in terms of how we deal with uncertainty and bring in precaution, and particularly, again, I mean, I'm interested in the conduct of impact assessment. And you know, impact assessment, there's inevitable. We're at a time and a place in development and decision making where some degree of uncertainty is inevitable. We're trying to forecast and understand what the effects of a project might be well in advance of them occurring. So, I mean, just to maybe state a little bit of the obvious for background. An adaptive management approach is really our safety net. It's our opportunity to track and to monitor, to see how right or wrong we got it, and adjust and tweak our management approaches as required. So it's, you know, an adaptive management approach obviously is a way to bring a degree of precaution, to bring in a second chance into the impact assessment, to the decision and the action, and adjust if we find that things are happening that we didn't anticipate, or effects or effectiveness of mitigation are different than what we anticipated and made our decision on the basis of. We all know adaptive management requires a bunch of stuff that hasn't always been a key part of impact assessment, or arguably not enough in terms of it requires good sound follow-up to verify predictions and test mitigation, and particularly requires a management system that allows for flexibility and make changes in a timely manner. What I'm interested in primarily, in particular, I think, you know, Professor Halling would tell us that adaptive management is an approach where you view projects as experiments and impact assessment as predictions as hypotheses, and you deal with them that way, and you test them, and you adapt appropriately. The really cool part of an adaptive management approach to me is this context of learning. Adaptive management as a way to embrace risk and uncertainty but in doing so, to build knowledge and understanding over time. So progressively, you decrease that uncertainty and make better decisions, do better analysis, make better decisions in the long run. I think in a lot of ways, just because of such a project-specific aspect of impact assessment, that we are still very much focused on learning and adapting in the context of the effects of an individual development or decision, where we need to get, I think, a bit beyond the idea of just rolling with the changes, really the effects of a particular project, but also more into the realm of collective learning and sharing. And that's really been the missing piece for me. So taking the monitoring, the results of the follow-up, the adjustments that we make, how effective they were in dealing with the effects and so forth, and compiling that knowledge and collectively learning from that experiences. So feeding that acquired information and knowledge into the refinement of standard mitigations for certain types of projects or management approaches across sectors or regions. And when we go through this process and we adapt and we manage and we mitigate and we learn, and we get to something that works and is generally applicable, communicating that knowledge better, maybe even codifying management measures and approaches so that expectations and requirements are clear, and progressively reducing uncertainty and reducing risk because of the knowledge that we've gained through those sorts of approaches. So adaptive management is a fundamentally good idea, as a good second chance safety net in impact assessment, but I think taking it forward, communicating the results of that are really key actions going forward. So just my initial thoughts on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And Justina, you will be our last speaker for today. If you would like to give kind of some concluding thoughts with an answer to this question.
Okay, so I'm going to try to do 3 things here in 4 minutes. Okay. Very much in agreement with the real value of adaptive management as sort of a means of really applying and learning oriented EA processes, so that you learn. Unfortunately, quite apart from impact assessment here that we're talking about today, there have been a lot of misuse of adaptive management, including in government communications, which is often has been, in certain circumstances, been more used as a means of muddling through. So we really don't know what's going to happen, but we'll apply adaptive management, but not in sort of a very structured way. But it's a means of, well, if it doesn't work, we'll do something else. And the important thing is that in the impact assessment process, and to a great extent in the new Impact Assessment Act, it's being more strictly applied, or at least it's being considered more strictly, and much in the context of learning. If we bring it back to precaution, and we think about the way that it has been misused in the past, we have to make sure that adaptive management is never used as a substitute for applying precaution in decision making. So not to punt a decision, we'll jet down to the adaptive management lane, we'll figure out how it works. The precautionary principle is really supposed to be that the lack of full scientific uncertainty should never be used as a reason to prevent measures that address environmental impacts right there, and not wait for the experimentation to happen before it occurs. Going back to the question, which I wrote down as the absence of evidence of risk is not the same as the absence of risk. Well, that's absolutely true. I mean, that's all inherent in uncertainty, and sometimes uncertainty is literally about an absence of evidence. But that that the uncertainty comes from the fact that there's enough experience of similar circumstances that one might infer a reason to be concerned or a cause for threat. And that even if you don't have absolute evidence in this particular situation, the threat is certainly there and there's cause for concern. And that is exactly where the precautionary principle would need to come into play, is in that kind of circumstance. I don't know if that works well for the answer of the question, but I think it's the best I can do with a clock that I've got. And I think I'll leave it at that. So, thank you so much.
Thanks, Justina. And that's a good start to answering the question. To the person who asked the question about the absence of evidence, I'm sorry we didn't get more time to talk about it. Scott has graciously offered that if you'd like to contact him directly, his email address is Findlay, Findla, @uottawa.ca. And if you'd like to follow up with your question, he'd be more than happy to talk to you about it. So we are quickly approaching the very end of our panel. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank each of our panelists for this interesting discussion. And it's fascinating to me how all of you come from such different backgrounds, but then many of your ideas converge. And so it's interesting to hear where there's agreement and also sometimes where there's not. I'd also like to thank all of our audience members for their participation. I believe we had almost 100 people online, which we are so pleased to have you all spend your day with us and to ask questions that I hope have challenged our panelists. Finally, I'd like to thank the Canadian Science Policy Centre for hosting our panel session today and adapting to this virtual format, which is maybe not the feeling of a traditional in-person panel, but still making it happen. And so thank you everyone for taking the time. We are going to conclude now. Just a reminder from the CSPC that you will receive a post-session survey, which will pop up on the screen moments after the session ends. And we ask you to fill that out with your feedback on the session. And feel free to reach out to our panelists if this has really stimulated some thoughts for you and you'd like to discuss further. So thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time today.
Bye.